Welcome back. Well, we're going to continue in our discussion of the Moynihan report, and we're going to begin at the subheading, the end of the beginning. But before we get into this particular subheading, I think that it would be nice and necessary for us to review what happened in the beginning of chapter 1. So let's do a quick review. All right. So now there are three main points that I want you to take from the beginning of chapter 1. The first point is that the Negro movement, which is what the report calls it, but that particular movement was one of the most important movements in American history. It was even compared in my notes to the American Revolution and the abolitionist movement. But when you put this on par with the American Revolution, you understand that this is a very important movement. And then we come to find out that the movement has international implications. We learned last week that the methods that have been employed by various leaders of various groups in our country in regards to obtaining equal rights for all citizens was used internationally. At the same time that the civil rights struggle was going on in the United States, the same methodology was being used in Africa. The same methodology was being used to free India from British rule. And so you can see that whatever happens in America in regards to race relations has a far-reaching effect on the rest of the world. So that's the second point that we talked about. And then the third point is one that we cannot deny. And so we're not going to overlook it. The awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we learned that in the report it was for the actions that he had taken so far in organizing and leading nonviolent protests and being an advocate of peaceful relations between groups, all groups actually in the United States. And so the award was in part for his efforts in the past, but then it was also for a beacon of hope for the future. Yes, they individuals who awarded this award to Dr. King, they realized that what he set up, the things that he had done, the path that he took was going to have far-reaching influence into the future. And so they were awarding him for his efforts in trying to be nonviolent, for his efforts in trying to work along with individuals in power to try to come to a peaceful resolution. And so those are the 3 points in review. Keep those in mind as we go further, because we're going to talk about now some of the things that led up to the current state of the black family. And we're going to talk about some of the things that had an impact to try to better the situation for the black family. So let's take a look. And we'll start, as I mentioned, with the subheading, the end of the beginning. So now, as the report helps us to appreciate, there are several events, several major events that came at the onset of what the paper describes as the Negro Revolution. And so what we're going to do, we're going to break that down into 3 categories. And the first category is the political events that happened. So now, one of the first things that we notice is that, as the report mentions, the African American community began to gather together, and they started to form a movement that was geared toward equal rights, a movement that was geared toward being able to finally attain to the status of a full citizen of the United States. And these particular organizations, according to the report, were more disciplined, and they were led better than any movement in the history of America. And so because of the fact that the movement was looked upon favorably, then the report goes on to mention that they had unprecedented alliances with religious groups all over the nation. And then they had close ties with both political parties. And then finally, they had involvement with labor parties in various segments of the trade union movement. So there you go. Almost in all sectors of life in the United States, the Negro movement had a part in it. And they had supporters that were found in those areas. So the second thing, when we're talking about political events, the Kennedy-Johnson administration. Now listen at this. I want to read this verbatim. It says the Kennedy-Johnson administration committed the federal government to the cause of Negro equality. This had never happened before. And so the stage is once again set. The full might of the federal government is now poised to try to remedy some of the difficulties that are occurring in the African American population. So now what's the third event? The third event is in 1964. The presidential election. That election was a referendum of the federal government's commitment to help to sort out some of the difficulties of the African American people. So now the report goes on to help us to appreciate the overwhelming victory of President Johnson. It affirms that not only was the federal government in favor of helping the African American community, but then because he was elected with such a majority, then that meant that the course of the federal government was something that the whole nation was behind. And that's not too difficult to understand. Because if you look back in history, if you look at the things that African Americans had to go through, some of the things at first were not things that most people knew about. But then when you look at the lynchings, when you look at fire hoses being turned on people, dogs being sicked on individuals, the whole nation was embarrassed to say that this was going on in the United States. Individuals who were not even a part of our group started to get involved, started to try to help the situation. They wanted to bring a peaceful resolution. And so this is just proof of it. The fact that President Johnson was elected was just further added proof that the nation as a whole was ready to try to help African Americans. Okay? So now that's the end of that particular section. So the next section involves administrative events that took place in order to help the African American people. And the first administrative event took place with the establishment of the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. And then the administration at that time added force to the Manpower Development and Training Act of 1962. And so the federal government also at that time launched a major national effort to redress the imbalance that existed between the Negro citizens and the rest of the nation on an economic basis. So now they're looking at the economy of the Negro American family. And so the report goes on to mention that this is derived, that inequality is derived from an unequal position in the labor market. So what does that mean? An unequal position in the labor market. Well, it means that at that particular time, there were individuals who chose, I should say, not to hire based on the group that an individual occupied. So if a person was of a particular color, maybe a particular economic status, then that particular individual may not get the position that they need. And if they didn't get the position that they needed, then they couldn't have any economic presence because they had no capital to invest in the economy. And so that made sense. And so the federal government is now looking to try to correct that imbalance. Okay? So what about the second administrative event? Well, the second administrative event took place in 1964. It's called the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. And here's where the federal government once again takes a national approach to trying to abolish poverty. So they're trying to do away with individuals living below the poverty line. And you'll be interested to find out that almost half of Negro families were living under that poverty line. And so once again, that 1964 Economic Opportunity Act was geared toward trying to correct that imbalance also. And then the third administrative event, it mentions there the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was an end of an era. That moment was. And so what it was geared toward doing is ending legally the ability for someone to formally discriminate against Negroes. And the report even mentions that there were new machinery that was put in place to even address covert discrimination and unequal treatment. So that 1964 Civil Rights Act was the third administrative event that took place to try to put African Americans in a better situation as far as their livelihood was concerned, both in the economy, and in their treatment. The act does not guarantee an end to harassment in matters such as voter registration, but does make it more or less incumbent upon government to take further steps to thwart such efforts when they do occur. So now, the Civil Rights Act, it was one that, as the supplemental information helps us to appreciate, it didn't prevent discrimination or harassment when it came to voter registration. But what it did was, when those matters became known to the federal government, then they would take the necessary action to prevent that kind of harassment. And I think that that was a reasonable approach to take. Now, let's look at the final set of events that would help to put the African American community in a better situation. The legal events that took place. And so it begins with the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And so what this did was, over a decade, the Supreme Court made it their position that they were not going to tolerate unequal treatment of their Negro citizens. The report even mentions that such treatment would be obnoxious to them, and that the courts would strike any sort of legislation down that would play into unequal treatment of any of its citizens. It makes it clear in the last paragraph of this subheading that that's not anything that the federal government or the Supreme Court, namely, would be involved in. And so it goes on to talk about, too, that the Supreme Court upheld Title II of the Civil Rights Act. The federal judiciary there, as we mentioned, the Supreme Court, it did everything that it possibly could at that time to make sure that the unequal treatment of its African American citizens was addressed. So now, after we've discussed that, what is the conclusion? Well, in looking at the subheading, especially the name there, the end of the beginning, you can see that the beginnings were what we would call the Civil Rights Movement. As we mentioned, the horrendous treatment of many who wanted to take part in non-violent protests, non-violent actions that would lead to shining a light on the persecution and the mistreatment of African American citizens in the United States. It had its effect, because we talked about how it was that the Kennedy-Johnson administration, and then later on the Johnson administration by itself, was a powerful force in using the federal government to try to remedy some of the difficulties that the African American family faced in that time. And then we talked about how it was that the overwhelming majority of individuals voted for President Johnson. His victory was one that couldn't be questioned, and this was, in a sense, the whole nation subscribing to the fact that President Johnson was correct in the views that he had and in the way that he used federal power to try to help to improve upon the situation for African Americans. And so the whole country voted for him. As the report mentioned, it was an overwhelming victory. So the whole nation is now poised to try to help African Americans. And then when we talk about the administrative events, all of the various acts that were put in place by the federal government, then you have the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. The Manpower Development and Training Act of 1962 is mentioned. And then we have the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. And then we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 also. So those are all the administrative events that took place that put into law that the unequal treatment of any American citizen was against the law. And then, as we mentioned, we have the legal events that took place, namely Brown versus Board of Education, and several other acts that came up, several other decisions that was made by the Supreme Court. And one of the things that we really want to focus on is the fact that the report mentions that the laws of the United States now look upon any such treatment as obnoxious, and that the courts will strike it down wherever it appears. And so it was speaking in reference to combating the unequal treatment of African American citizens. And so we've considered quite a bit, but all of it is in response to the way that the individuals of that time of the African American community rallied together, the way that they involved themselves in nonviolent protests, the way that they conducted themselves. The report even referred to it as them being organized and led in a way that was better than any group in the history of the United States. So it's good that we were able to go over a portion of the Moynihan report. Next week, around this same time, we're going to go into the demand for equality. And now, for me, this was absolutely a interesting subheading, because we're going to come to find out that there is a subtle difference between liberty and equality. So if you want to know what that subtle difference is, I invite you to please like, comment, and subscribe. But then also come back and let's finish our discussion of the Moynihan report. As I mentioned, we're going to go subheading by subheading, chapter by chapter, so that we can get a full understanding of what's being said and what has been done. As always, man, we love you. Be easy.